Huangzhong. They all happen to accord with it as pitches that could be derived from the tonic of Huangzhong or the gong of Huangzhong. Thus, it is said that the tonic of Huangzhong is the basis of the paired sets of pitch standards, the Lü Lü. The Yellow Emperor also commanded Lingwen and Rongjiang to cast 12 bells so as to harmonize the 5 tones and apply them to majestic musical compositions. Reading Yingxiao here is a kind of general term. In the month of mid-spring, on the day of Yimao, the 52nd day, when the sun was in the lunar mansion of Kui, he had them played for the first time, naming this composition Harmonious Pool, Xianshi. So this passage is really interesting on a number of levels, in terms of both the technological and philosophical elements of how the origins of music were conceived. Regarding the former, the first thing to notice is how the 5 tones and the 12 pitch standards are, while clearly differentiated to be sure, in one sense nonetheless conflated from the outset. The seminal note at once created and discovered by Lingwen is described not simply in terms of its absolute pitch, right, as a standard to be given the name of Huangzhong, but also in terms of its relative pitch, the gong, or the tonic, or the do, if you will, of Huangzhong. And what we mean by absolute pitch is, for example, in Western terms, the pitch A being set at a frequency of 440 hertz or cycles per second, which is to say an absolute standard that does not change. Whereas the pitch of A could also function as the do in a major scale of do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, in which what we call a movable do system is essentially a term of relative pitch, and any absolute pitch could function as a do in any given scale. So, strictly speaking, in the generation of 12 pitch standards, that is, absolute pitches, Huangzhong, or the yellow bell, should be able to stand on its own. And once the system is established, the same pitch could be just as easily be labeled as shang or rei in the key of the pitch wi, or the jue, the mi tone, in the key of the pitch yize, and so on, as it can the gong, the do, in the key of Huangzhong. By here attaching the bass tone of the pentatonic scale, gong, directly to the fundamental pitch standard, Huangzhong, the text points to the fact, I think, without ever explicitly spelling it out, that the 12 pitch standards are necessarily derived in a way that accords precisely with the natural parameters of the pentatonic scale, which was the fundamental scale in early Chinese music, equivalent to do, re, mi, sol, la, or in the Chinese solfege terms, gong, shang, jue, zhi, yu. Now, historically speaking, practice almost invariably precedes theory, right? It's systems of standardization are normally developed to bring pre-existing forms of practice in line. The case with music is certainly no different. In the ancient Chinese case, songs with simple instrumental accompaniment, sung with melodies built up upon the pentatonic scale, had no doubt long been around naturally. And naturally became the prevailing type of melodic structure long before the advent of the Warring States period, or 475 to 221 BCE, the time when this text was written, and probably well before anyone had even begun to give any thought to the notion of melodic structure in the first place. That is, they came about naturally simply because they sounded intrinsically good to the human ear. Standardized pitches, on the other hand, are not really necessary for simple musical production, and only come into play once the need is felt to combine musical instruments on a scale in which they can no longer readily be tuned against one another, especially once ensembles begin to include such fixed pitch instruments as bronze bells and chime stones. Such a progression is seen in the Guyue chapter itself. Preceding this entry on the Yellow Emperor and his music master are 3 others, 2 of which entail the creation of dances, and the other of which involves a minister under the rule of some earlier Zhuxiang royal house, creating the 5-string zither, right, wu xian se, an instrument which notably can simply be tuned against itself according to the relative pitches from string to string, without any need for absolute standardized pitches. Only with Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, do we see a music master ordered specifically with the task of creating pitch standards, 律. Notably again, Huangdi's first act subsequent to the creation of those standards is to offer a second command, this time to both Lingwen and Rongjiang, the latter presumably an expert in the somewhat different technology of metallurgy, to cast a set of 12 bronze bells, the quintessential fixed pitch instruments that would encapsulate and preserve these pitch standards that were originally determined, according to the story, through bamboo pipes, with the express purpose now of harmonizing the 5 tones and applying them to majestic musical compositions. Well, what does it mean to harmonize the 5 tones, which are by definition already a set of musical tones existing in an ordered and harmonious relationship? Let's say that the qin zither is tuned to 1 pitch, and the sheng mouth organ is tuned to something like a quarter step away, and the flute somewhere in between. Then while each may be internally in tune and capable of harmoniously performing the 5 tones on its own, they can never really play in harmony with each other until they all agreed to tune to an agreed standard. Now, while small ensembles of instruments may well be able to do this on the fly, once we have large orchestras capable of performing the kinds of majestic musical compositions inferred in this passage, particularly those containing more than one set of fixed pitch instruments, then pitch standards clearly become indispensable. So just as large-scale states require standardized weights, measures, and currencies in order to flourish, civilized music, as it were, requires its own standards if it's to move beyond the realm of what we might call more tribal ensembles. So how is this act of creation conceived? Like many meaningful acts of human creation, it's not really so much a creation at all as it is a purposeful discovery of patterns inherent in the natural world and the application of those patterns to human endeavor. The narrative arc of the passage serves to highlight the fact that both the fundamental absolute pitch of Huangzhong and, by extension, the entire 12-tone system of intervallic pitch relationships were derived from the nature of the cosmos itself. Though at the same time, human action appears to serve the indispensable role of bringing the incipient harmony of the cosmos to its ultimate fulfillment. Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, the legendary creator of many aspects of Chinese civilization, commands his music master, Lingwen, to travel essentially to the far western extremity of the known world, ascending to the base of perhaps its most exalted mountain, where he selects a perfect segment of bamboo that happens to accord with a number of human measurement easily divisible by 3. This fundamental note, and along with it the 11 others that can be generated from it by the simplest of mathematical manipulations, just happen to accord with the cries of nature's most venerated birds, the phoenixes, which in turn happen to be naturally tuned to a strictly proportioned series of notes alternating between male and female. As thus the symbol of both cosmic and imperial order, Huangzhong, the yellow bell, is the pitch that corresponds to the supreme ruler himself, an oral expression of his accomplishments and the order that derives from his rule. Now, the precise manner in which Huangzhong generates the remaining 11 pitch standards is spelled out in quite a number of, or in a number of other early texts, including a different chapter of the Liu Zhi Chunqiu entitled Yin Lu. Now, this also serves to explain again the significance of the initial length of 3.9 cun, which is probably an error for 9 cun, as a variant reading in another text version of this passage has it. So the significance of this initial length and its relatively easy divisibility into 3. So here we have Huangzhong gives rise to Linzhong, Linzhong gives rise to Taicu, Taicu gives rise to Nanlu, and so on and so on and so on. Skipping down to the red portion. An upward generation is produced by adding a third of the length, and a downward generation is produced by subtracting a third of the length. So think upward means lower in pitch and downward higher, kind of counterintuitively. So Huangzhong, Dalu, Taicu, Jiazhong, Guxian, Zhonglu, and Ruibin are generated upward, whereas Linzhong, Yize, Nanlu, Wuyi, and Yingzhong are generated downward. The method of generation described here is in musical terms that of generation by fifths. More specifically, ascending fifths and descending fourths, which result in an equivalent note an octave apart. As this chart will help to explain. So here we have the 6 male pitches on the left and the 6 female pitches on the right. So A flat generates E flat, and then E flat generates B flat, and so on. And at one point, you need 2 consecutive upward generations, that here a downward arrow, to stay within the octave, as in the case here of for example, G going down to D, and then down to A. To make this simpler in terms of sound wave frequency, if we instead take A 440 hertz as our hypothetical starting pitch, then the ascending fifth of this pitch would result in E at 660 hertz. The descending fourth of this pitch then going on down to B at 495 hertz, and so on. Now, at the 12th generation by this method, we arrive back at a rough equivalent of the original pitch, but with a mathematical discrepancy of about 23.5 cents, known in the West as the Pythagorean comma. A discrepancy that's just small enough not to dissuade the average human ear from perceiving it as essentially the same pitch. Now, what's remarkable here is how beautifully and naturally this all fits together to produce precisely the number corresponding to the number of lunar months in a year, all by means of the consistent manipulation of the simplest of mathematical ratios, right, 2/3. And this correspondence is even more striking because of the mathematical discrepancy that remains at the end of the cycle, which could easily be conceived as a natural corollary to the discrepancy between the number of days in the lunar and solar years. In any case, the correspondence between the pitches and months was certainly not lost on the early Chinese. And the subsequent passage of Yinlu, which associates the pitches with the monthly winds, is precisely an attempt at lending exactitude to that correspondence. So just to quote a few lines here, in the age of a great sage in a perfected order, the breaths of heaven and earth combine harmoniously to give rise to the wind. And when the day that marks each month arrives, the wind is encapsulated into a bell for that month so as to generate the 12 pitch standards. Thus, the shortest solstice day of midwinter gives rise to Huangzhong, late winter gives rise to Dalü, early spring gives rise to Taicu, and so on. And then the concluding line, when the winds of heaven and earth are correct, the 12 pitch standards are established. So the 12 pitch standards take on enormous importance in early Chinese philosophical tradition. But we must remember that they ultimately derive from the musical properties inherent in the pentatonic scale itself, as the passage in question implicitly assumes. Regardless of how the mathematical properties inherent within them were discovered, it's clear enough that the gamut of 12 tones is simply the logical extension of the pentatonic scale itself, which is formed by the first 4 steps of the process of generation described earlier, a relationship that can be seen from these figures, this time shown from the starting pitch of C. And the figure on the left, so basically, yeah, you know, so you go gong to chi, and then all the way to Jue, and then the same thing, if you extend that on outward, you eventually get to all 12 tones this way. The figure on the left is precisely what is described in a recently unearthed Warring States manuscript called the Weintu, or Diagram of the 5 Tones, that David has been working on a translation of and talked about an hour ago. Thus, there's a clear organic relationship between the pentatonic scale and the chromatic gamut of 12 pitch standards, and it really couldn't have been otherwise. And we can understand this by thinking about how, for instance, alto and tenor saxophones are able to play together in the same ensemble, right? Which is because while one is keyed to play in E flat and the other in B flat, Both instruments are capable of playing the same chromatic gamut of 12 notes, a gamut inclusive of both scales of E flat major and B flat major. And of course, any other scale and alteration of those scales, and literally any other scale of any other key that might be called for. Transposition is possible only in a system in which the octave is divided into a series of notes spaced more or less equidistantly from each other, and such a series is inclusive of the scales upon which the music is composed and performed. And so that's the point I'd like to stress about the relationship between pitch standards and scales in their solfege terms. Now, this entire picture is, in different ways, both corroborated and complicated by the monumental discovery of a 65-piece, heavily inscribed Zheng Hui bell set, excavated in 1978 from the tomb of the Marquis of Zheng, who died 433 BCE, located in the town of Leigudun, Suizhou County, Hubei Province. On the one hand, the bell's self-describing inscriptions corroborate the intimate relationship between the 12 pitch standards and the solfege terms that describe, at root, the pentatonic scale, but which also go well beyond that scale, as we'll soon see. On the other hand, as some scholars have stressed, the bell nomenclature tends to emphasize the series of pitches that texts of the Warring States period classify as the liu lü, right, otherwise known as the yang lü, over the set known as the liu lü, or the yin lü. Insofar as the latter don't even appear to be named at all in the standard nomenclature of the bell's Zheng manufacturer, right, seen here in the second column, and are only given names in the corresponding true state equivalents, which are also mentioned here in the inscriptions in the fourth column here, where each is labeled as simply the zhuo, the muddied or flatted version of the yanglu pitch, half step above. Which is to say, the main pitch standards, or keys in column 2, serve to divide the octave into 6 equidistantly spaced whole steps, more or less, rather than 12 half steps. Now, what we might make of this is open to interpretation, but it's at least clear that the liu lü, the 6 yang pitches, cannot possess any inherent musical properties on their own, especially because in the Warring States, musicians could not possibly have been playing tunes based on whole notes. Rather, all the various pitch standards, whether the primary or subsidiary ones, function basically as keys in which different compositions, based on the pentatonic scale and its elaborations, could be played. Now let's delve into this a bit more by way of an example. In this case, the second bell of the lower rack, which, like all the Zheng bells, is capable of playing 2 tones spaced either a major third or, in this case, a minor third apart, depending on whether the bell is struck in the center of its lower face or on one of the sides, either the right or left side of that lower face. Now, the musical inscriptions on both faces of the bell, seen here, along with their pitch equivalents, read as follows. And here, things are going to start getting a little bit more technical, so please bear with me. Now, the first thing to note here is that the default solfege names, the ones which appear on the main face of the bells without any accompanying key information, right up here at the top of the slide, are all in fact in the key of guxian, and not notably huangzhong. Guxian conveniently happening to correspond more or less to the key of C. Now, this is true of all the Zheng Yong type shafted bells, which occupy the lower and middle tiers of the rack, though not of the Niu type bells hung in the upper tier, which are in accordance with a different key and won't concern us in the discussion here. So this bell, struck in the center, plays the shang tone, the re tone in solfege terms, here D, in the key of guxian, C again. And struck on the side, it plays the tone of yu zeng in that key, which in our terminology means the perfect fourth, or here F, a tone that in fact lies beyond the standard major pentatonic scale of, again, tonic, major second, major third, perfect fifth, and major sixth, right? 宫商角徵羽, or C, D, E, G, A. The zeng added here to the yu here represents an instance of the primary means by which these bells indicate tones that are not members of the pentatonic scale. By the affixing of either a jue, or alternatively termed fu, indicating a major third above, higher in pitch, or zeng, indicating a major third below, or perhaps two major thirds above, equivalently, to any member of the pentatonic scale other than jue itself. So these would be affixed to one of the other four tones. Now, the second way, seen here in the first line of the front right inscription, this Wenwang Zhishang, Wenwang Zhi Bianshang, is attached by adding the prefix bian, indicating a scale degree flatted by one semitone, in this case indicating a minor second scale degree. And so Wenwang Zhi Bianshang, that is flatted shang in the key of Wenwang, refers to the flatted shang, or second degree, in the key of E, the key of Wenwang, which is to say the equivalent of a flatted F sharp, or in other words, F. And similarly, back in our main key of Guxian, the yu zeng here on the left side of the main face of the bell, refers to the scale degree a major third below the major sixth, or the zeng of yu, which is to say, in our way of thinking, the perfect fourth, which of course corresponds to F in our key of C. So in other words, we have here examples of two different names for the same pitch. That is, the pitch of the bell when struck on its left or right side, the same pitch in two different keys. Now moving to the center, the front center inscription on the reverse face of the bell, we were first told in what key this bell's pitch functions as the tonic, or the gong. Now, not all bell equivalency inscriptions in the Zhonghui bells begin with or even necessarily include the tonic key, but this one does. And in a number of the bells, when the tonic key is introduced, the inscription also introduces the name by which the same key, or pitch standard, is referred in certain states other than Zheng. So in this case, the state of Chu, where it is called Pinghuang, and Shen, where it is called Yize. And it's worth noting, just as an aside, that this Shen state Yize represents an entirely different pitch standard than the same name does in the nomenclature found in received texts, which is another unique thing here. Now, these instances of explicitly spelling out the alternate state names only occurs when the tonic, the gong notes, are referred to, never with other tones. Though the names themselves are found without reference to the state in question in all kinds of other tonal situations. The aforementioned Wenwang Zhi Bianshang in the front right inscription is just one such example. We know from inscriptions on other bells that Wenwang is the state of Chu's name for the bell that is otherwise referred to as Hanyi, as seen here. Clearly two different names for the same key. Now the following table, which we briefly showed earlier, spells out all the state equivalencies found listed in the Zhonghui bell inscriptions. And note that a couple of the keys appear to have an alternate standard name, that is used without ever referencing it to another state, such as the muyin that appears equivalent to taizu in the second row here. And that, with the exception of the chu terms, which appear just as often as the unspecified terms, the latter presumably being the ones that are standard in the state of zeng, keys of other states are represented only sparsely. So if we return to the bell we were examining, but I'm going to go here directly in the slides to the solfege nomenclature chart. If we were to return to that bell, we would see the line Tai Cu zhi Jia Gui. That is the Jia Gui tone in the key of Tai Cu, where the term Gui or Jia Gui in green here appears in these inscriptions to be another way of saying the jue, saying jue in the role of a primary pentatonic note, perhaps particularly within the lower registers, as a number of these tones have alternate names depending on which octave register they belong to, and that's here in columns 3 and 4. Now, the rest of the inscriptions on this bell follow from the aforementioned principles, with the particular anomaly of the front left inscription, 瑞宾之直府下爵, in the penultimate line here, where the 府下爵attached in a number of the inscriptions to either 直 or 语 seems on the face of it entirely equivalent to the term zeng, though spelled out more explicitly as, in effect, the major third above the major third of the note, which is not, however, actually how I understand zeng precisely. And what to make of it is still something of an open question. And finally, and most noteworthy back here on the inscription, in the front right portion, the lines 文王之变商 and 韩语, Han Yi Yu Jue, both refer by different names to the same note in the same key. That is the minor second in the key of E. And the lines 一则之直增 and 瑞宾之直府下爵 on the front right and left striking portions of the bell here in light blue shows a similar sort of equivalency through different names, both indicating, in this case, a minor third in the key of D. And we'll get back to all this in a second. Now, stepping back a bit, if the pentatonic scale was the primary means of musical expression at the time, what was the significance of all the references to non-pentatonic scale notes in the inscriptions? Could it simply have been, as some have suggested, due to theoretical or extra musical considerations? While this is certainly possible, I would suggest we not be so quick to dismiss them as such offhand, but rather at least ponder what role they may have played in musical performance, and at least see where that line of inquiry might lead us. So to do that, we might begin by asking why, if affixes like jue and zeng were indicating raised or lowered thirds, why they occur alongside such alternate prefixes as bian, indicating a flatted tone, especially when both types may be used to represent the same scale note within the same key. Theoretically, the apparent randomness of these alternate names appears messy, and there doesn't seem to be any systematic basis for these alternations that would lend itself to elegant theorizing. But if we think instead in terms of musical terms, it may yet all turn out to make perfect sense, as we're certainly not unfamiliar with such confusing apparent equivalencies in Western music. Even our absolute pitches contain such ambiguity in naming, with musical implications already built in. That is, the fact that the sharp of one pitch is equivalent to the flat of another, such as A sharp and B flat. The same pitch is necessarily spelled differently in different keys. For instance, we spell B flat in the key of F, where it is the perfect fourth, but it's spelled as A sharp in the key of B, where the same pitch functions as the major seventh. Now, given that Chinese pitch standards are referred to by traditional bell names rather than ordered letters, the same possibility cannot apply to those pitch names. But differences in musical functionality are surely apparent in the alternate solfege names, solfege terms that we see in Zhonghui bells. In the West, note that in one context, a note that in one context might function as an augmented fourth may in another serve as a flatted fifth. In the context of a dominant seventh chord with altered extensions, as appears in jazz music, we might speak of an augmented fifth rather than a minor sixth because of its tendency to resolve upward to the major third of the tonic chord. In a minor scale, on the other hand, we can only speak of a minor sixth, right, such as E flat in a G minor scale. And sometimes even octave distinctions are recognized, not perhaps wholly unlike some of the octave distinctions that were observed in Zhonghui bells, wherein the prefix yan serves to mark lower octaves and the prefix xiao and the suffix fan, the higher ones. So to return to our dominant seventh chord example in jazz music, we can speak of the alteration of a sharp ninth, but never a sharp second, as this is a note that can only work in the upper register of a chord. As in the lower register, it would be perceived instead as the minor third and clashed directly against the major third that is at the structural center of that chord. So might it be possible that the distinct solfege terms that otherwise represent the same interval from the tonic in the Zhonghui inscriptions are no less the result of differences in musical function? And if so, how might we begin to explore this possibility? Now, we might have a clue in the aforementioned instances of dual inscription lines that indicate in different ways effectively the same scale degree in the same key. To return to our earlier example, one of several that we could cite, why is the minor second in the key of E labeled yu jue, that is a major third above the major sixth, when the key is referred to as hanyin, but labeled bianshang or flatted shang when the key is referred to by its true name of wenwang? Could it be that the melodies played in that Chu key are built on a different sort of scale than those played in the equivalent Zeng key? And might this point to regional differences? Were the Zeng bells meant in part to ritually treat or entertain diplomatic visitors by performing at least one tune from their home state? Let's explore this question by first examining the two different series of tone combinations that are inscribed on the Yong bells for each of these two respective E keys. So listing all the tones on all the bells explicitly associated with these two keys in respective order of pitch. Now for the key of Hanyin, the result is as shown here. And note in this chart, the lowest pitches are at the top. So this arrangement of inscription notes, in fact, thwarts our initial hypothesis. Right. Given that bianshang does occur in the Hanyin assemblage alongside yu jue, albeit only in the uppermost register, which may suggest that the distinction does not mean so much after all. And the fact that both yu jue and bian yu, the highest note here, both occur in the absence of any yu itself, also suggests that the terms may not bear any musical relationship to yu within the melodies played in this key. Perhaps further suggesting the terms might not be all that meaningful after all. Nonetheless, interesting patterns do emerge from this exercise, namely that in addition to the tonic, the minor second, minor third, and to some extent the perfect fourth appear to be key features of the scale. But if we're looking for consistency across all registers, the anomalies are puzzling. The tonic doesn't appear in the lowest register. Only the minor second appears in all four registers, and the major third effectively replaces the minor third in the second register. and the lone minor sixth appears only in the highest register. So given both the patterns and anomalies, to what extent the assemblage of Hanyin solfege combinations in the inscriptions were intended to be musically meaningful remains an open question. And I should note here that my analyses of these focus of my analysis of my focus here is on the Yong bells of the entire bell set. But this is a bell set that was originally assembled from different groups of bells. So a more refined analysis, at least another track of analysis, would be to pay further attention to which tones appear in which bell groups. Also note that I'm not making any distinction between the tone marks, the tones struck in the centers versus the sides of the bells, though the inscriptions themselves tended more or less regard them with equal importance. In any case, let's now look at the Wenwang key combinations. So here we have much greater consistency, and indeed an entirely different sort of pattern than we had with the Hanyin set. With the tonics that flank both ends, the only anomaly is the lack of a named major third for the second register. Now that missing G sharp 3 is indeed available as a side tone of the lower rack 2.3 bell. But while Hanyin zhi xiajue is inscribed there, Wenwang zhi xiajue is absent. However, since the center tone inscription of the same bell states that Wenwang is the true name for Hanyin, perhaps this information was meant to implicitly carry over to the side tone as well. Now, if that's true, then we have an entirely consistent scale here of tonic, minor second, major third, perfect fourth, major sixth, strange as that scale may be. This is precisely the standard pentatonic scale, with the exception that the major second has been lowered to a minor second. And thus may be entirely appropriate from a musical standpoint that these minor seconds are consistently labeled bianshang rather than yujue, if we understand a term like bianshang to mean a flatted version of shang. Now, let me go ahead and play this for you. Oops. You said, oops, you said you're on a right click? Okay, and then this one. Hmm? Right, something different, right? Okay, so in the interest of time, we can go back. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to skip over the rest of the examples I've tried out, which is good because they're in fact not all that conclusive. What I draw from the limits of what this sort of inscriptional evidence might tell us is that, in part, only so much information could be included within the limited space of the inscriptions. And that if they were indeed intended for musical purposes, the musician performers no doubt had access to some kind of supplementary cheat sheets to help them fill in intermediate details otherwise unavailable to us. This should not, however, discourage us from working from what we have and exploring what sorts of options afforded by the rich chromatic possibilities of the Zhonghui bells may have actually been utilized in practice. Through such examination, I think recognizable, if imperfect, patterns do in fact emerge. And continued gleaning of the inscriptions might yet reveal that a number of different scale structures were employed in the performance of these bells that have no other precedence in the written record of early Chinese musical practice. Now, another way of looking at such terms as jue or fu and zeng might be in terms of these two columns, might be in terms of creating a functional system that will actually work for purposes of musical performance. Worth emphasizing here is that if we leave the bien terms out of the equation, all 7 of the 12 notes that lie outside the pentatonic scale can be generated, as it were, by adding either of these affixes, that is, either by raising or lowering a member of the pentatonic scale by the interval of a major third. Alternatively, and more elegantly for the system, if we start with the tetratonic scale of gong, shang, chi, and yu, that is the tonic and the first 3 generations of circle of fifths, then the remaining 8 tones can all be generated by major thirds, right here again in these 2 columns. These 2 columns here, right? These 4 and right, yeah. So these 4 and these 4, and adding those to the first 4, we get all 12 tones. So could it be that the intended exact pitches of the Zheng Hou Yi bells were actually crafted through such a system? Might they, in other words, reflect the first attempt at a kind of temperament, not equal temperament exactly, but one that at least divided the octave in a way that marked by regularity and effective enough for the functional purposes of transposition? So let me explain. If the 12-tone gamut is generated entirely by circle of fifths, then we end up with the Pythagorean comma once we reach the near octave equivalent at the 12th generation, an octave higher. And so we have to either arbitrarily ignore that comma by beginning the next octave at the true 2-to-1 octave equivalent, and thus living with a dissonant wolf fifth, as it's called, between it and the penultimate pitch, or simply allow the circle of fifths to spiral on upward by doubling down on the Pythagorean comma each subsequent octave, which would be even more unworkable for a multi-register ensemble designed to allow transposition. A better alternative might be to generate an initial core of 4 pitches and then generate the remaining tones from that. In this case, by switching from the 3/2 pitch frequency ratio of the perfect fifth to the 5/4 ratio of the major third. The following table shows the differences from equal temperament, which wasn't developed until the 16th century. The differences from equal temperament in frequency by both hertz and cents resulting from the difference resulting from methods of generation by fifths alone versus generation of the 4 core notes by generation of the 4 core notes by fifths, followed by generation of these by major thirds. So a quick glance at this chart reveals that the method does not bring us all that much closer to equal temperament, which is a theoretical and practical construct that was, of course, not really available to the bells manufacturers. And while slightly closer overall, in a couple of cases, even generates even larger gaps between adjacent notes in a couple of these. But for a set of bells that span several octaves, the system of intonation was nonetheless clearly superior to pure generation by spiral of fifths, insofar as it closes the octave at the exact 2-to-1 frequency, and also one that would work better for the predominant key of guxian, for reasons that will become clearer in a minute. It would thus have provided a system in which transposition among keys, between keys among bells spanning different octaves would have been possible, imperfect as those transpositions may have been. What's remarkable, though, is how closely this apparent Zheng system of intonation is to the system of just intonation developed relatively early on in the West, as shown in this table. So as we can clearly see, this method of fifths plus thirds is exactly equivalent to just intonation, save for the fact that the A pitch here, the last generated member of the tetratonic scale, or the yu tone, if you will, and the two pitches generated from it each differ from their justly intoned equivalents by approximately 21.5 cents. Why is this so? Well, I don't have time to go through all the math here, but suffice to say that the development of just intonation in the West, beginning around the 2nd century AD, involved accounting for such musical realities as the harmonic triad and the diatonic scale by tuning each note strictly in relation to the tonic by an exact interval defined mathematically by a simple ratio within a 5-limit system, which is to say such simple ratios as 3/2, the perfect fifth, 4/3, the perfect fourth, 5/3, major sixth, 5/4 was major third, 6/5, minor third, 8/5, minor sixth, 9/5, minor seventh, 9/8, major second, and so on. And as would be discovered much later in history, the fundamental basis of just intonation is the naturally occurring series of overtones known as the harmonic series, produced by the simultaneous oscillation of sound-producing medium at different wavelengths. So just intonation has an entirely natural basis in the inherent properties of acoustics. Now, assuming, as I do here, that the Zheng Hui bell manufacturers calculated the ascending and descending major thirds by the same 5/4 and 4/5 ratios as in the West, then it's easy to see how most of the pitch frequencies derived from this Zheng system would be precisely those used in Western just intonation. And again, I'll skip over the mathematical calculations. The reason why the major sixth, the yu, and its two derived pitches of perfect fourth, the yu zheng, and the minor second, the yu jue, why they differ between the two systems is because in the West, the perfect fourth was calculated directly from its simple ratio of 4/3, whereas its zheng equivalent, yu zheng, was calculated by decreasing the major sixth by a major third. Now, had these early Chinese technicians derived the fourth note of the chord tetrachord by going a perfect fifth below the tonic rather than extending the generation of ascending fifth upwards from shang to yu, they would have ended up with a system exactly equivalent to Western just intonation. And I'll just note that historically, just intonation succeeded Pythagorean intonation as musicians and composers would, in later times, sought to tune their instruments in a manner that would more directly incorporate the musically rich sounds of the major and minor thirds, in contrast to Pythagorean tuning, which relied solely on perfect fifths and fourths. In Pythagorean tuning, as with the Sanfen Sun Yi Fa, key scale degrees lay in more complex ratios to the fundamental tone. Now, the system employed in the manufacture of the Zheng Hui bells, if it were indeed as the solfege names might imply, may well have been a similar attempt to provide musical concordance and richness to the tuning system designed to play melodies with the pentatonic scale at their core. It's an open question, however, as to whether such a system might have constituted a general development upon a Sanfen Sun Yi Fa method of tuning, which still appeared as the predominant feature in texts of the late Warring States. However, due to likely degradation of the Zheng Hui bells and possibly even imperfections in their original manufacture, we can never ascertain from pitch measurements alone exactly what system the bells may have been tuned by. What's clear from the inscriptional practice in the bells of describing how the same bell pitch functions as one scale degree in such and such a key and a different scale degree in another shows that the bells were indeed intended collectively as an instrument in which transposition from one key to another was not only possible, but actually put into practice. As our apparent conflation of solfege names and pitch standards in the foregoing discussion of intonation may serve to belie, however, the system is of necessity an imperfect one, entailing sacrifice, as just intonation and a theoretical system of equal temperament can never completely fall in line. Okay, so to wrap things up, the question of intonation aside, the fact that the bell manufacturers were able to create a bell set that included a full chromatic gamut spanning 2.5 octaves, and which was wholly intended to allow transposition between different keys, may well have in and of itself influenced musical practice. The pairings in the musical inscriptions suggest different scale structures and the use of tones that go well beyond those of the standard pentatonic scale. And while it's certainly possible that these were intended to play unorthodox melodies that already had precedent in prior musical practice, it's no less likely that such unusual melodies may have resulted from experimentation with the new possibilities afforded by the varied advancements in musical technology. In more general terms, it may be that the discovery and codification of pitch standards themselves led to new practices in music. To bring in a more recent instance of this sort of phenomenon, I think it's intuitively obvious that nothing like Schoenberg's 12-tone compositions could ever have come about in a folk music tradition devoid of theory or indeed equal temperament. It was clearly the product of theoretical experimentation based upon the long-established chromatic gamut of 12 pitches. Might something of the same sort, on a less extreme level, have happened in early China, where the theory and technology impelled the artistry in new directions? Such a scenario is not at all unlikely, and it would in fact be surprising, I think, to find that such impressive technological advances had no such effect on musical practice, at least at one point in time, even if the pentatonic scale would indeed continue to dominate Chinese musical composition. The imaginary phoenixes that Lingwen heard on that day, of course, were singing to each other in the perfectly harmonious interval of the cycle of fifths. And the sweeter melodic interval of the major third was effectively ruled out as a mating call. But heaven only provides the model. It's up to mankind to harness, refine, and sometimes even beautify it. Just as the seasonal alternations of growth and decay in the natural world provide the inevitable basis for the parameters of food production, yet the latter is channeled through agricultural means to provide a rich and reliable variety of food resources in ways that nature alone could not. Musical production no less relied on the fundamental mathematical properties of sound revealed through heaven's natural pipings of bamboo forests and songbirds in order to ultimately move beyond it and, in its own way, bring it to a greater form of perfection at the same time that it remained entirely based within heaven's acoustical mandate. As the major third of heaven's tonic as a major third to heaven's tonic and Earth's perfect fifth, mankind's role was surely indispensable in forming quite literally a triad with heaven and earth. Now, what precisely this may have entailed in musical terms is something that we're still a long way from understanding in detail. But the technological innovations exemplified by the曾侯乙bells are surely a key piece of the puzzle. And further mining of these bells further mining of the rich inscriptional evidence can only serve to more fully bring the music that they once performed alive to our ears. Okay, so before I conclude, just a couple of, sorry, not yet. A couple of musical examples to show how different keys would sound in the hypothetical system of Zhang intonation. I can take it. In the hypothetical system of Zhang intonation described above. Okay, so this first one will be Mo Li Hua in the Zhang key of Guxian or C. The great thing about the software, it allows you to make microtonal adjustments. So if you see these kind of gray numbers that are all smushed together, those the tones adjust in sense to make it correspond to the system of intonation that these bells hypothetically were tuned against. So this is this is how the Zhang bells would sound more or less played in the key of Guxian or C, which would be theoretically the most concordant key for them to be played in. Okay. Then let's do the same tune played now in the key of G flat in a Zheng C tuning system. So in other words, a tritone away, which would probably be it should be the most discordant key within such a tuning system. Okay, kind of sounds a little like my guitar when it's out of tune. Um, but you may have noticed, especially the tonic gong, as in the repeated high note in the first stanza, as well as the perfect fifth, the zhi tone, as the low note at the very end, both seem especially flat. And if you're interested later, I could illustrate why. But all the pitches are still recognizable, even if slightly flatter or sharper than usual, and with a fair amount of beating going on. But for the tolerant ear, which the ancients may well have had relative to us, it still works well enough and even gives the particular key a unique character. Okay, now for my final pair of examples, I wanted to see what the difference would sound like with a chromatically richer tune. Um, for which purposes I chose one by the great Billy Strayhorn. Um, Here, in this case, arranged by the great interstate collaborative team of Marquis E., Count Basie, and Duke Ellington. So who says there were warring states? These cats were all about making harmony, right? So first, in C, or guxian, in a hypothetical Zheng intonation. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. And then finally, but in again the Xinzhong key, or G flat, the furthest key away. All right, so a bunch of blue notes in there. Right? That's the Marquis of E style. All right, so thank you. Thank you so much. I think
let's open it up to questions. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions. So why don't we just start with the room, and then we can go to online if necessary. But let's see. Any questions? Yes. All right.
Hey, very fascinating. So also very interesting to me how similar the fundamentals, not of just the music theory, but also the cosmology around it is to Western cultural history. So like the Pythagorean idea of, music of the spheres and all that. I'm just wondering, because in the West, it's like a paradigm that underlines everything for like more than 2000 years. Is it similar in the Chinese tradition? And the second question, this is also already a big question, but is there how much transmission of ideas do you think there is?
Well, I think in terms of that question, I'm under the assumption that these, because of when they developed, I think they were developed entirely independently, which is fascinating because that really tells us something about the human ear.
Exactly,
And yeah. Just because, yeah, I don't see the means of transmission at that point in time. And yeah, no, I think this kind of correlative thinking with between the 12 notes, the five tones, the five phases, the 12 notes, 12 months, all this pervaded through through much of Chinese imperial history. And we have in many dynastic histories, treatises on the calendar and pitch standards. I mean, some of the names of the treatises are actually where those are combined together into a single chapter of the dynastic history. So that proved to be a fairly pervasive way of thinking throughout the pre-modern era, basically.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for the talk. I don't know very much about early Chinese music history, so I was just curious, are there any compositions that have been transmitted from that time period, or what's the earliest time when you have a record of like an actual melody?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because we're just talking about some of those in the workshop earlier because I mean, I think the earliest, until recently, the earliest musical scores we have date from the Tang Dynasty, and I don't think that even the Tang Dynasty scores are particularly easy to read. From the Song onward, we have musical scores that I think are well known how to interpret. But recently, there's been a couple of excavated manuscripts that we're still trying to figure out, but dating from the Warring States period. One the one that David is translating from volume 13 of the Qinghua bamboo manuscripts, dating roughly to 300 BCE or so. That seems to be there's some controversy about how it should be interpreted, but it seems to be a gongshang musical score. In other words, that actually has those characters, the gongshang jueju, and a couple others we don't quite know how to interpret, but just one after another in a way that seems to suggest a musical score. Without, and we don't know whether it's what the meter is. I mean, if they're each given a quarter note or how that's supposed to work. There's a lot of questions, but in other words, yeah, we do have some very early musical scores, and even more complicated one that Professor Chung here is working on making it kind of figuring out how it's put together, and those will be published within a couple of years' time. But yeah, some very difficult. Well, in this case, one that might involve fingering as well, and a lot of complicated factors. We really don't know how to read these scores. I think because there's just so much information that's not there that would have been known to the users that we can only speculate about. But yeah, so in other words, the earliest ones we have available that we kind of have some sense of how they're played will be from the Tang, or at least the Song onwards. But we are discovering some very early musical scores now. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So my question is, we you have this sort of system of intonation that you're positing based on your interpretation of these
Right.
texts. And then we actually heard what some melodies would sound like in this system of intonation. Are there any texts that talk about differences in character or color or affect between melodies played in these different keys based on this intonation?
No, because I mean, we don't. This is entirely speculation based on the inscriptions from these bells alone. There's nothing in the received text. And again, what we have in received texts are basically, philosophical texts and maybe some later on historical texts. And but from this period, we don't have any much in the way of actual texts that are focused on music, right? But in any case, we don't have anything that describes such a system at all. We only the texts of that period all talk about things like the method of generation by fifths. So this is very much speculative and hypothetical, but it makes perfect sense within the way. We also don't have any of these sung and these affixes or anything like that found in the received text either, but they're clearly there in the Trong Bells inscriptions. So yeah, it'd be nice if we had more to go on from that. But no, it's all based on these bell inscriptions. There would be in subsequent centuries would be many attempts to kind of come up with some sort of equal tempered system, which get really complicated. And I don't have expertise in that, but from the early years of the first millennia AD or CE, but yeah, nothing in the Warring States that goes into any temperament sort of discussion at all.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was fascinating. I was very interested on the one thing you mentioned was the notes that was spelled differently for one pitch, which is a very standard way of doing in the Western music notation. So because I don't really know much about Chinese ancient music, but I'm curious if that's some sort of evidence that say that within one piece in the Chinese ancient music composition could also have lots of transposition within one piece, because if you have this bian notation for notating a different spelling, then does that indicate that sort of composition that's similar to like Bach's composition in piano? That's my
It's similar in what sense? You said similar to Bach. In what sense exactly?
For example, in Bach's piano pieces, like preludes, within like just 10 measures, there could be 4 times of transpositions. So I was because I don't know much about the Chinese music, so I wonder if the composition from the bianzhong could also be transposed a lot within just one piece.
You mean in terms of like modulating from one key to another within a piece, or
yeah, or probably it's a completely different way of thinking. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, there's really so little we know about what Warring States music sounded like, how it was composed, even if it's was primarily pentatonic, or whether it's more of a diatonic scale like we see in a couple of different sort of fundamental diatonic scale keys have been posited. One that would correspond to Ionian mode, one corresponding to Lydian, basically, and which are like referred to as the Guinjie and the Xinjie. But I think all of this is really based on speculation because, again, there's not much that the text of the time tell us. There's no recordings, obviously. But the bells do point to something that the texts don't really seem to focus on because, again, it's well, they have the 12 pitch standards, of course, but when in terms of the Ean, it's all pentatonic scale that comes up in these, and so the Zheng Hou bells are very unique in that sense because they do imply that there's something else going on, that there's some sort of either different scales being used or well, there's or more complex scales that are not just pentatonic that have and will have different variations than that sort of basic standard. So which is different from what we were just talking about, the earliest score that from Xinhua volume 13. It seems to be based entirely, or at least maybe with two possible exceptions, we don't really understand, on a pentatonic scale. So there's kind of conflicting forms of evidence in this regard. But the short answer is there's just so much we don't know about it. But again, I think the Zheng Hou bells really point to a much more complex system than we know about from textual sources.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, Professor Cook, thank you for your really wonderful talk. I learned a lot. I have two questions regarding your talk. First, I would like to ask you more about the just intonation. Are you suggesting for that I didn't get it? Are you suggesting just intonation is the reason that the Zheng bell casters or musicians were like generating the 12-note gamut? Or so is that one of the reasons for that? And then the second one is that there are like a lots of the changing of the keys and also from the tonic. So what do you think about the reasons why they are listing this as a like inscription? Are they playing some games here, or are they like doing this like transposition as a way to show off the musical knowledge, something like that?
Okay, so first question, what I'm saying is that I wouldn't call it just intonation because it is slightly different, but what I'm suggesting is a similar sort of solution was found to the problem of the Pythagorean comma, the problem of temperament. A similar sort of solution was found to what was found utilized relatively early on in the West as well. Again, I believe entirely independently, but and for similar musical reasons. And now the second, I didn't quite get the second question, was that
the reasons for putting these inscriptions on top of the bells.
Oh yeah,
yeah. What do you think about like? Yeah,
I think some of it may have been practical. Some of it, the bell set itself is meant to make kind of a political statement too, as well. Probably, it's sort of an impressive display of wealth and power, just having this bell set and perform for your. I assume it again, maybe it all kinds of different occasions, including with diplomatic visitors and the like, as well as perhaps at sacrificial ceremonies as well. But I do think it does suggest there is also a practical function involved that may have been, a reference point for some of the performers. But the other thing to note about the inscriptions, they're really beautiful, very stylized characters. So there's a visual display was a very important part of it as well. And you said so maybe to show off as well, but perhaps, so again, there's this bell set was somewhat unique in terms of being able to play this all 12 notes of the gamut for 2.5 octaves. We don't know of any other bell set from the time period that's anything like this, right? So there's probably some degree of showing off as well. Again, is just the bell set itself is so imposing and impressive. So I think all those factors are involved, and to put it in a short answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we probably only have time for maybe one short question still. maybe I shouldn't say that short, but hard to predict these things.
Doctor, yeah, I have a question. Yeah, as you listed in some tables, yeah, we noticed here are some similarities and differences between Chinese music system and Western music system, such as 宫商角徵羽 are corresponding to do, re, mi, sol, la. Yeah, so I'm wondering, and such traditional Chinese instrument is quite influential. But my question is that has such instrument influence the Western music composition as well as the design of music instruments?
As the Chinese instrument influence?
Yeah, does such instrument influence the Western music composition?
I mean, I don't think there's any sort of direct influence in there except maybe in more recent times where people have, composers have tried to do more cross-cultural types of things as a way of broadening their musical horizons and trying out new things. But I think traditionally, probably not much. It's not so much. Not that I'm aware of anyway.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Right. So
Chinese music would itself be enriched by different musical traditions coming in from the West, or from the Near East. Different. I think the pipa originated didn't come in until, I don't know, closer to the Tang Dynasty, for instance. Just like in terms of musical cross-cultural influences, there is definitely there's definitely changes in music that happen over time within different traditions. But in terms of when we talk about the sort of the common practice Western musical tradition, I can't think of anything in particular that comes to the top of my head.
okay. All right. Well, as the final part of our talk, I would like to present a gift to Professor Cook from a small token of our appreciation from the Faculty of the Humanities. We're supposed to take another picture here. So
Use this in Singapore.
useful in Singapore, yeah. So, and then we're going to have a photo. Okay, so let us thank Cherry and the Faculty of Humanities for organizing this event. And most of all, thank Professor Cook for flying all the way here and sharing this really quite amazing cross-disciplinary talk with us today. So thank you so much. Thanks.
Recording stopped. So for those who did not take the attendance before the start of this seminar, you can come to here for taking the attendance for our record. Thank you.